Corruption and decades of disappearances haunted the quiet town of Maplewood, hidden beneath a veil of trust. Mayor Daniels, a respected leader, turned out to be at the heart of the betrayal, silencing truth for years. But John Mercer, guided by a wounded dog to a forgotten chest by the riverbank, uncovered the evidence that changed everything. Just listen to how shocking the turn of events in this drama was and why justice ultimately prevailed. John Mercer lived quietly now. The war was behind him, but its echoes never left. Every morning, he would step outside his modest house in Maplewood, a small town hugged by forests and the slow sweep of the river. Once, the world had moved fast for him, filled with orders, chaos, and duty. Now his days moved with the slow rhythm of the water under the bridge, and his nights were often filled with restless dreams he could not shake. He walked for peace, and he found it along the edges of the river where the air smelled of wet stone and moss. That afternoon, the sky was heavy with low clouds, a gray silence pressing over the town. John had wandered farther than usual, past the usual walking path, where the riverbank bent sharply and stones jutted out like broken teeth. It was there he saw something strange: movement. A German shepherd was limping along the shore, its fur matted and dull. A thin line of dried matter stained its leg, and each step seemed to cost it. The dog moved with a quiet determination, as though it had a destination it could not ignore. John froze for a moment, heart tightening. The dog's condition was bad, but there was something in its eyes, not fear, not pain exactly, but something deeper, a kind of quiet urgency. John approached slowly, careful not to startle it. The dog glanced at him, then kept moving, limping toward a part of the riverbank John had never explored. His instincts told him to call for help, but something inside him, an old reflex from years of service, told him to follow. Not just to help the animal, but to understand why it was there. The ground beneath his boots was uneven and slippery with moss. Sharp stones cut through the air with every step, and the wind carried the scent of riverweed and cold water. The dog moved ahead, pausing only briefly before pushing onward again. Its steps grew slower, but its resolve never faltered. John matched its pace, his breathing steady despite the climb. They came to a stretch where the river narrowed, and jagged rock formations rose like the remnants of something ancient. The sound of the water here was louder, a rushing undercurrent that seemed to pull the air into itself. The dog stopped suddenly just in front of a dark cluster of stone that jutted out like a barrier. John stepped closer. The dog sat down on its haunches, head tilted slightly, and looked up at him. Its eyes were fixed, not on him, but on the rocks ahead. There was no bark, no whine, only a quiet persistence. The moment hung between them like a question without an answer. Something in John's chest tightened. It was more than curiosity. There was a pull, an unspoken sense that the dog was not here by chance. The way it had led him across uneven ground, through weather and stone, made him feel as though it was guiding him somewhere important. The air seemed heavier here, as if the riverbank itself was holding its breath. John crouched beside the dog, studying the jagged stones. There was something unusual about the formation. A shadowed crevice, narrow and deep, almost hidden from view, unless you came this close. The dog shifted, glancing again toward him, then back to the stones, as though urging him forward. For a long moment, John said nothing. He just looked at the animal, then at the dark gap in the rock. His mind was filled with questions. Why here? Why now? And why him? Finally, he made his decision. He adjusted his jacket, tightened the strap of his satchel, and took a step toward the stones. The dog rose slowly, limping, and moved ahead again. John followed, the weight of something unknown pressing against him. He could not see what lay ahead, but he knew, somehow, that this was the beginning of something he could never have imagined. John's boots slipped against the slick stone as he followed the wounded dog deeper along the riverbank. The jagged rocks rose like an ancient barrier, their edges sharp under the pale light filtering through the clouds. Every step he took brought him closer to a strange sense of unease. Not fear, exactly, but something heavier, like walking toward a truth he was not yet ready to meet. The dog moved with slow determination, stopping occasionally to glance back at him, urging him forward without sound. John crouched low, feeling the rough stone bite into his palms as he crawled upward. The wind grew colder here, carrying the faint tang of the river and something older, dust, stone, and something unsaid. At last they reached the edge of a natural stone wall, where the river's noise dimmed into a quiet hush. Hidden in shadow, a narrow crevice appeared, barely wide enough for a man to slip through. The dog paused, pressing its body low against the earth, as if guarding the entrance to something sacred. John swallowed hard, his breath clouding in the cold air. His fingers brushed the stone. The surface was worn, shaped over time by water and weather, yet the crevice felt deliberate. A hidden door in nature's wall. Without thinking, he squeezed through, limbs aching from the climb, the dog slipping beside him like a silent guide. Inside, the space opened into a shallow cavern carved by time itself. The air was thick with the scent of earth and something older still, something forgotten. At the center of the cave lay a wooden chest, battered and darkened by years of neglect. Its iron bands were rusted, the surface mottled with age. The sight made John's chest tighten. This was no ordinary object left to time. The chest was sealed by 3 heavy locks, but one had clearly been broken. Rust flakes scattered as he brushed his fingers over the iron. His breath hitched. He glanced at the dog, whose eyes were fixed on the chest, unblinking. Slowly, John lifted the broken lock, wincing at the creak of shifting metal. Inside was a collection of strange treasures. There were stacks of yellowed papers tied loosely with string, a cloth bundle that gave off the faint scent of damp earth, and a small metallic box stained with rust. The air seemed to grow heavier as John reached forward. He touched the bundle first. The fabric was coarse and worn. He untied it carefully, as though disturbing something sacred. Inside were photographs, brittle with age. His fingers trembled as he lifted them out. The images were of people, men, women, children, each face frozen in time. His breath caught. They were labeled in neat handwriting, dates spanning decades. And then one photograph stopped him entirely. It showed a man standing beside a group of shadowed figures near the riverbank. A scene that seemed impossibly recent, yet faded like a memory. John's stomach twisted. The man in the photo was identical to Mayor Daniels. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the smallest detail. The same jawline, the same set of eyes. John stared, heart pounding, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. These were not just photographs. They were evidence of disappearances that had haunted Maplewood for decades. And they pointed to something far larger, a secret hidden in plain sight. John turned his gaze to the metallic box. Its surface was cold, pitted, and unmarked. The thought of opening it made his pulse quicken. Somewhere deep in his chest, a voice whispered that this was no ordinary find. The dog, lying quietly at his side, let out a low whine. It was as if it understood what lay ahead. For a moment John sat still in the shadowed cavern, chest tight, mind racing. The weight of the chest in his hands was not just physical, it was the weight of a truth that could change everything. Maplewood would never be the same again. And neither would he. John walked back into Maplewood as the sky turned low and gray, the wounded dog trailing silently beside him. The chest was heavy in his arms, its worn wood pressing against his coat. The riverbank behind him seemed to hold its breath, as though guarding the secret John now carried. By the time he reached the town, a chill had settled deep in his bones, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he had found. The streets of Maplewood were quiet that evening. Lights glowed warmly behind curtained windows, and the faint hum of life carried softly in the air. Yet the town felt different to John now, like it was holding something back. Somewhere beneath that surface of calm, something dark had been buried for decades. He made his way toward the town hall, where Mayor Daniels often held informal conversations with townsfolk. The mayor's office light was still on. John's steps slowed when he saw Daniels standing near the door, speaking quietly with an aide. The mayor turned at the sound of his boots, and his expression shifted, not to welcome, but to something more guarded. "John," Daniels said with a tight smile, "I heard you were out by the river." His tone was polite but strained. "I found something," John said quietly, placing the chest on the steps beside him. "Something that matters." Daniels glanced at the chest, then at John, and shook his head. "That's old rubbish. Just something left by a local hoarder years ago." "Best you let it go, John. Nothing good comes from digging up the past." But John saw the hesitation in Daniels's eyes. It was fleeting, yet it was enough. The mayor's dismissal felt less like concern and more like fear. A cold knot of certainty began to form in John's chest. This was not casual. This was a denial to protect something deeper. John left without another word, the dog following close behind. That night, the weight of what he carried filled his small apartment. He set the chest down with care and began to unpack the contents. The photographs alone told enough to unsettle him. Faded faces of people who had vanished without explanation. Records with dates, names, and strange annotations. Maps marked with coordinates. Each page seemed to speak of a conspiracy buried in silence. As he turned the brittle pages one by one, the documents revealed patterns, meetings held in secrecy, names that kept appearing, connections that tied directly to Mayor Daniels. There were notes referencing people who had disappeared near the riverbank, years apart, and references to places John had never heard of. The pieces began to fit together into something darker than he had imagined. Anger rose in him, not just at the mystery itself, but at the betrayal. Mayor Daniels was not simply a man hiding a secret. He was part of a network of hidden acts, a web woven in silence, betrayal, and omission. For years, the people of Maplewood had trusted him. They had trusted him to lead and protect them. And somewhere along the way, that trust had been broken. John's hands clenched around the papers. The wound in his chest was not the dog's injury. It was something deeper. It was the wound of knowing that those he trusted had been deceived, that the town he loved was built, in part, on lies. The dog lay quietly at his feet as John worked late into the night, piecing the fragments together. Somewhere in those photographs, maps, and notes lay the truth. And he could no longer ignore it. John's anger was no longer quiet. It became a kind of resolve. The dog had brought him here for a reason. He knew it in his bones. This was not just about the mystery in the rocks. This was about justice. John looked at the chest one last time before locking his apartment door. Tomorrow, he would confront the truth, and he would not turn away. The river outside whispered softly, carrying its own secrets downstream, as if it too was waiting for what was to come. Morning arrived in Maplewood with a soft wash of pale light, the river gleaming under the dawn. John Mercer rose early, the weight of the night's discoveries still heavy on his mind. Sleep had been restless, filled with fragments of images, whispers of questions. Outside, the wounded dog stirred in the corner of his porch, eyes fixed on him as though reminding him of what had to be done. John moved quickly. He called a few friends he trusted, Clara Jennings, a local teacher, and Tom Reynolds, a retired firefighter. Men and women who knew his integrity and shared his concern for the town. Together, they gathered what they could carry and returned to the riverbank where the mystery had begun. By mid-morning, word had spread. Curiosity grew into something larger. The riverbank filled quietly at first, then steadily, as townsfolk arrived in clusters, their faces drawn with questions. Phones were out, whispers passed between neighbors, and the local news crew appeared with cameras and microphones. The river seemed to hum under their footsteps, as though anticipating the revelation. John placed the chest carefully on the stone shelf near the jagged wall. Police arrived soon after, their presence lending weight to what was unfolding. Uniformed officers examined the scene with practiced seriousness, while curious onlookers murmured behind ropes of caution tape. The air was thick with anticipation. An officer pried open the chest. The sound of rusted iron breaking was sharp in the hush that had settled over the crowd. Inside lay stacks of yellowed documents, brittle with age, maps marked with strange symbols, and a sealed metallic box that shimmered faintly in the morning light. Some papers carried names, dates, and notations in handwriting long forgotten. Others contained diagrams and coded notes. The evidence pointed clearly to one thing. Mayor Daniels was not merely a respected figure in town. He was tied to decades of disappearances and secretive dealings that had been kept from the people. As the truth emerged, the crowd shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Murmurs grew louder, faces hardened. The mayor himself was nowhere to be found. For the first time in years, Maplewood seemed to breathe differently. The chest's contents were more than proof of crime. They were proof of decades of hidden truth buried beneath years of silence. Shock gave way to an undeniable sense of release. People looked at each other as if letting out a long-held breath. Justice, however delayed, was finally beginning to take shape. John stepped back and surveyed the scene. The river's current glistened in the morning light, carrying away the last traces of quiet. His eyes fell on the dog, resting now on a patch of soft grass nearby. Its breathing was slow, steady. It let out a low whine, the sound soft but certain. Then it lay still, as if it had fulfilled something greater than itself. John approached it slowly, kneeling beside his silent companion. He stroked its head gently, his voice low. "You led me here," he said, almost to himself. "Not just to a mystery, but to justice." A wave of relief spread through him, deeper than he expected. The riverbank, once a place of loneliness and unanswered questions, now held something different. It had become a place of truth, of reckoning, of healing. In the days that followed, Maplewood changed. Mayor Daniels was called to answer for the past. Investigations unfolded. People spoke openly for the first time in years. The town came together, no longer divided by suspicion, but united by the relief of knowing the truth. John found himself at peace. The war inside him, the one he thought he had buried long ago, had shifted. He had found a new purpose in a place he thought was quiet and forgotten. The dog, once wounded and silent, now rested as a quiet guardian of that truth. At the riverbank, John stood once more, looking out over the water. Somewhere beneath the stone and moss lay a story that had waited decades to be told. And now it had been told. For John, for Maplewood, there was relief at last.